Good morning. Welcome everybody to Urban Green's annual conference. My name is John Mandyke. I'm the CEO of Urban Green, and I'm going to be your conference moderator for today. Look, at more than 440 people are joining us for this conference today to understand how we unlock the grid to get more renewables to New York City. And I think this speaks to the fundamental interest in this issue and the importance for why all of you are joining us this morning, for which we're grateful. This discussion is as important as ever, especially now that buildings are tied to the carbon intensity of the grid through Local Law 97. Now, before we start, I think it's really important that we reflect on the world around us. COVID-19 has fundamentally changed New York City and our world. The response to the murder of George Floyd is fundamentally changing society's approach to equity here in New York City and also around the world. We're thinking long and hard, and my bet is most of you are too. Urban Green is committed to using our mission to make a positive change for public health, for racial equity, and for environmental justice. In the face of these, climate change is the long-term backdrop to these immediate challenges, and how we transition our grid is central to all of that work. So as we listen to the presentations today, I hope we can start to think in a new way, not just about the nuts and bolts about how we're going to green the grid, but also the social and environmental equity issues that we must consider at the same time. There's no question there's a lot of work to do, and I hope we can do it together. So let's get started. We've worked really hard to bring a different online experience for you for this conference in the most compelling way. Now, we have plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions. So after our first keynote panel, we'll be taking questions for the first, second, and third sessions of today's conference. Below your live stream window, you'll see a box to submit those questions and the ability to upvote your fellow attendees' questions. Panel moderators will be monitoring these questions throughout each session, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. It's really one of the best parts of the Urban Green experience. Now, we also have a lot of resources for you also below the live stream feed. You'll see social media handles for all of our speakers, and we encourage and really hope that you will engage in a broader conversation with your social networks about what you hear and what you learn about today. We also have other resources for you around the very discussion we're having, such as Urban Green's State of the Grid brief that we released just last week to prepare folks on kind of baseline knowledge for the conference. That's in the resource area, so be sure to take a look. Now, I want to show you a slide that's going to provide context for our issue here in New York City. This is New York City's current electrical supply, both imported into New York City and what we generate in New York City. And you'll see 65% of that power comes from fossil fuel sources. Again, both imported and those generated here. The other big piece, the 25%, is nuclear power, and that's going away next year when Indian Point closes. And it's going to be replaced with more fossil fuels until the renewables come online. Look, this slide, this is our reality. This is our challenge. And frankly, this is our opportunity because we can only get better from here, and we must. And I have to tell you, we have a vested interest in the buildings industry to pay attention to this because the future of buildings is now tied directly to this chart, to the carbon intensity of this grid. That's the backdrop for this conference. Now, over the last year, I've heard a wide range of opinions about the grid. You know, many are skeptical that the grid will ever green, or it will green in time for the Local Law 97 challenges and timeframes. Yet others, many others, are convinced that the challenge is solved because of the solid plans that are in place that you're going to hear about today. This wide range of opinion really gave birth to the conference, and the need to bridge the divide on views and to bring the latest facts by those making the decisions and by those actually doing the investments on the ground. I know we're in for a great morning because we have a super lineup of speakers, and I know we're going to learn a lot and we're going to hear the latest. Now, these events can't happen without sponsors that make it possible. So we're very grateful for Carrier as our conference sponsor this year. And a big thank you to our friends at Carrier. We plan to show several short videos to you today on how you can get involved with our work. But the first video I want to show you is from our sponsor, Carrier. Thank you again to our sponsor, Carrier. Now, I'm really excited to get started with our keynote panel. Last week, I sat down with the policy leaders of New York to understand where we're going from a policy perspective for the grid. Look, it all starts with policy, so that's where we're going to start the conference. Take a look. I'm really excited to kick off the conference today with a policy landscape by literally the power brokers of New York. So joining us today is Alicia Barton. Alicia is the CEO of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, also known as NYSERDA to most of us. Welcome, Alicia.
Hi.
Great to have you here.
Thank you,
also joining us is Gil Quinones. Gil is the CEO of the New York Power Authority. Gil, welcome. Great to have you with us.
Welcome everyone.
And also joining us is John Rhodes. He's the chair of the New York State Public Service Commission and the CEO of the Department of Public Service. John, welcome. We're thrilled that you're with us too.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Wood Green, for having me.
Great. So let's get right into it. You know, the timing of this conference is really important for two reasons. First, we know that Indian Point nuclear power plant is shutting down, and that means the grid in New York City is going to become more carbon-based before renewables come to scale. And the second reason this conference is important is because Local Law 97 now binds the future of buildings exactly to that grid. So given those two factors, my first question to all of you is, what are the barriers that we need to overcome to make sure that we green the grid in New York City? And Alicia, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, again, thank you for having us for this conversation. It's a critically important one. We really are at an inflection point and a crossroads, and maybe some other metaphors I could think of about where we go from here in terms of the electric grid across our state, as well as specifically in New York City. And you mentioned a couple of big drivers in the Indian Point retirement and Local Law 97, but there's a number of other things happening at the exact same time, including our statewide efforts. As I hope everyone's aware, under Governor Cuomo's leadership, New York State has put in place one of the most aggressive climate laws in the world, in fact. And so we have a lot of work to do, not only to green the electric grid, but also to decarbonize buildings, as we're talking about today, as well as transportation. And all these things are happening at once, and they're also highly interrelated, right? And that's the whole conversation that you set up about the intersection of the grid and buildings. We, have a number of important choices ahead of us. And frankly, not a lot of time, unfortunately, to tackle some of these transitions. The timelines involved for Local Law 97 and under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act at the state level sound far off when you talk about 2050 and 2040 and even 2030 goals. But given the nature and long lead time on the capital investments that will need to be made in order to drive these transitions, time is actually very, very short. So we have to, tee up the exact questions you've asked. What are the barriers and what are the solutions? And I know we're going to get into that conversation. I want to, turn the microphone over to John and Gil to talk about some of that. But as we look forward, we're going to have to not only focus on, the retirement of one particular facility or its replacement with one particular solution, but a really comprehensive, holistic approach to bringing forward as much new clean electricity as we can, and at the same time focusing heavily on reducing the energy intensity and the consumption in buildings at the same time, to sort of synergistically come together to meet those incredibly ambitious carbon reduction requirements.
Well, thank you, Alicia. Gil, what are your thoughts? What are the barriers that we need to overcome?
Oh, there's no silver bullet to get to it, right? We need to do multiple things, multiple solutions to get there. We need to work on modernizing the grid, which we're going to be talking about today, both transmission and distribution. We need energy efficiency, and we probably have to lead with energy efficiency, right? To really manage the amount of use and the flexibility on how our buildings use energy. So I would say energy efficiency, flexibility. We need to modernize the grid. We need to bring in more large-scale renewables and distributed renewables. When I say large-scale, both onshore or on the ground, like wind farms and solar farms, and offshore wind, and be able to deliver those green electrons to New York City. So it's not one solution. It will require multiple technologies. It will require an innovative regulation and policy making, which we luckily have here in New York. We have a nation-leading set of laws, regulation, and policies to make this happen. So a lot of work, but I'm optimistic that we are on the right path.
Great. John, what are your thoughts? The barriers that we need to overcome to green the grid in New York City?
Great. Thank you very much. So John, look, I think not surprisingly, Gil and Alicia and I and the entire state team share a view of the reality we're confronting. I do think we have a system to build. It's not just this project or that project coming on or coming off, but we need an electric system that's for the future, which is going to have a lot more renewable generation, both large and small, bulk and distributed, skill set. We're going to need to have transmission to connect it from wherever it is to the load, to the demand, to the customers, which really is meaningfully in New York City. And then we're going to need flexibility in order to handle the ebbs and the flows and the peaks in a way that's going to be, well, the challenges are going to be different from the future. So we need a system. We need technology, and we need to harness it. And there's a couple of types of technology. There are the new energy solutions, new ways of providing electrification solutions in a building, or new kinds of ways of managing energy efficiency. And we need the kind of smart on the grid, the grid at all levels, and the grid that reaches, from what we think of as the electric system to on the other side of the meter, to sort of interact with things on a customer's premise that make sense. And then Gil started with efficiency. I'm going to end with efficiency. The more we do of it, the smarter we're going to be about everything, and the more we're going to be able to manage the challenge. So that we've got a system to build, we've got technology to harness, and we really need to continue to make the great progress we have been making on efficiency. And like Alicia, we already have momentum that's pretty encouraging. But the world requires us to do more. New Yorkers require us to do more, and the governor is going to hold us responsible for doing more. So that's where we are.
Thanks, John. I just want to echo that too. I mean, energy efficiency has always been, will always be the first best act, and we certainly support that at Urban Green. But Alicia, back to the comment on momentum, and it's already been mentioned about offshore wind. Offshore wind is a big, big piece of the puzzle here, and NYSERDA is certainly leading the charge in this area with tremendous leadership. Can you tell us where do we stand today with offshore generation, and how much of that will be available for New York City?
Yeah, thanks for teeing up this topic, because it's an incredibly important one for the future of the New York City electric grid, and one that I know people are really starting to recognize for the significant potential that's there. But it has been one that's been, I think, in the minds of so many New Yorkers, sort of just over the horizon, proverbially, as well as almost literally, when we think about where the wind turbines will be located, far off the coast of New York. It's been out there, and people keep wondering, is it really real? Will it ever happen? And I think, I want to frame up just a couple numbers and a couple ways I think people should think about what this resource will mean to the transition of the New York City electric grid. So starting at the top, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act codifies Governor Cuomo's nation-leading goal of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. To put that, in context, that'd be a little less than a third of the entire state load, depending on, again, how, what the load forecast is, depending on where we are with beneficial electrification and energy efficiency, and some of those puts and takes that will impact those forecasts. So it's a significant resource. It's very, very sizable, and can, really be an asset for particularly decarbonizing the downstate electric grid, because we anticipate that, a good proportion of that amount, it's not hardwired or specified, but a good proportion of those 9,000 megawatts, we believe, will interconnect either directly into New York City or in proximity to Zone J, in a way that will be feeding green electrons, offshore wind electrons directly into that grid. So that's going to be really a game changer for our ability to directly interject new renewable energy into the zone. Where we stand today is that we have projects under development. They're not generating and delivering those electrons just yet, but they will be in a relatively short amount of time. So last year, Governor Cuomo announced a nation-leading commitment to 2 offshore wind projects for a total of 1,700 megawatts, 816 of which are planned to connect directly into Zone J. The other project is planned to interconnect onto Long Island. So we'll still be serving downstate load, all 1,700 megawatts. Those projects are currently projected to be in service in 2024. So that's really not too far off, and will serve as an important backfill to the generation that's coming offline from Indian Point. We also are very focused on keeping momentum, and the governor announced earlier this year that he was calling for another solicitation for offshore wind of at least 1,000 megawatts, and the Public Service Commission has approved that, and we anticipate moving that solicitation forward in the not too distant future, as we move past the current restrictions on economic activity in New York State, and look forward to the Build Back strategy. And offshore wind can be a critical component of that. It has the opportunity, as a new heavy industry here in New York State, to create significant new jobs for offshore, for industrial workers, for construction workers, maritime workers, and that's something we're also very focused on, with a number of related efforts on workforce development and training. But just looking at the system, it's a big mover in our ability to decarbonize the downstate electric grid. And again, we're talking about thousands of megawatts in the not too distant future, if we can get those projects through the permitting, constructed and online on schedule for 2024, 2025, and 2026. So this is not a 2040 scenario. It's much more near term than that.
And then just a quick follow-up. So Is the balance going to be made up by more wind, or do you see a mix of generation to meet the longer term goals for New York City?
Yeah, it will be a mix. So, offshore wind again is probably it's the largest slice, but it's not the only one. And we see, a role for, and again, I'm only talking about generation, putting aside energy efficiency and grid flexibility and some of those other topics for a moment. We do see a role for, additional renewables to come online. Solar, distributed solar, certainly in the downstate area, but also larger installations of new utility scale wind and solar upstate that, we believe with some, additional transmission investments that the state has recognized will need to come forward, can also be delivered into Zone J and be a part of the solution as well. And I'll just before handing it over, because my colleagues can speak about, how those pieces will come together. Going back to your original question about barriers, one of the barriers we have been facing as a state is to get large infrastructure projects built. That's not unusual to New York State. That happens in a lot of places, but we have struggled with permitting and construction timelines. And there was a significant step forward just this spring when Governor Cuomo and the legislature came together to pass the Accelerated Renewable Energy and Community Benefits Act, which will significantly streamline permitting and development of large renewable energy projects upstate. And again, that could be a significant asset to add to the mix with additional investments needed to deliver it into Zone J.
Well, thank you, Alicia. That's a perfect segue to my next question for you, Gil, is, I'd love your take on transmission, especially in light of the new office that's been created in New York. But, we've had this bottleneck for years where we have, excess renewable power in upstate New York, and we can't get it down into New York City. And now, some of the private development lines are planned, and, we're going to cover that in later panels on the conference. But, my question to you is there a public role to play here with transmission? And just overall, what does the future of transmission look like in New York?
Well, as Alicia mentioned, the legislation passed as part of the governor's budget was really very, very helpful. That's going to help us develop and permit transmission lines going forward. If you recall, early in his administration, the governor had an energy highway blueprint initiative, and that actually resulted with some transmission projects that were built. NYPA built one of them. We called it our Marcy South series compensation, which increased the transfer capability from the Utica area to southern New York, using the existing lines, just adding smart grid technology. And also Con Edison built Ramapo to Rock Tavern. And all of this were part of to solve the Indian Point scheduled retirement. With this new legislation that was passed during the governor's budget, or as part of the governor's budget, now we have an accelerated process. And with the help of the Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission, there will be a study that will be done to look at how should we modernize our transmission and distribution system. But let's just focus on the transmission system. And those studies will then identify three types of projects. Ones that need to be accelerated and fast-tracked. Those projects will be assigned to the New York Power Authority. So that is a public solution. Other projects will go through what's called FERC 1000 process, public policy transmission process, a work between the Public Service Commission and the New York Independent System Operator, and then local upgrades that local utilities will have to do in partnership with the Public Service Commission. So there is this framework now to get large-scale renewables from remote areas into the grid, integrated into the grid, and transported down to the load centers, including and especially downstate New York.
So what, is there potential here in public right-of-ways to increase, transmission capacity? And I guess my question is, how much more can we squeeze on public right-of-ways? And is that on the table for consideration?
Absolutely. In fact, that's our preference. That's the priority. How can we utilize and build transmission within existing right-of-way, and not just physically building, but applying new technology? I mentioned Marcy South Series compensation. That's an existing transmission line owned and operated by NYPA. We applied smart grid technology, and we were able to push 400 megawatts more of electrons from upstate to downstate. The Con Edison project, Ramapo to Rock Tavern, was transmission within existing right-of-ways. And the projects that NYPA is undertaking right now, we're rebuilding a line from northern New York to the Adirondacks, 85 miles. We call it Smart Path. That's upgrading an existing transmission line. There are 3 others that are in the permitting process right now, one in western New York, and that went through the New York ISO PSC process for public policy transmission. Those are largely going to be built within existing rights of way. And the 2 other transmission projects called AC transmission, segment A and segment B, one north of Albany, one south of Albany. Also, those are going to be built substantially within existing rights of way. So that's the preference. The preference is to build within existing rights of way, maximize that capacity, and apply smart technology to really push a lot more power from upstate to downstate.
Is there potential with the New York State Thruway rights of way as you get down into New York City?
There are existing transmission lines along the Thruway, so those are part of the consideration as we start exploring where do we build. It's easier, and also, you can do the permitting faster if you use existing rights of way.
Right. Well, speaking of permitting, John, I want to come to you next. Your agency, regulates most power issues in the state and affecting New York City as well. So, my question to you is, what role can the PSC play to accelerate the renewable development that we really need?
So there are a couple of different roles that fall to us. One is, really about unlocking renewable generation and spurring more of it, and that clearly falls out of the 70 by 30 target in the CLCPA, and also, of course, in the 100 by 40 target, where that basically calls for an update to the not so old 2016 Clean Energy Standard, and an update that's designed to just get more smart renewables built. So that's one major set of activities. That is work that's going on. Alicia's agency and Gil's agency and my agency have all been working on it, and we're going to see action this year, before the end of the year, basically promulgating what we call an order, which is a set of rules about how this is going to be, that's going to achieve those goals, including the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind that Alicia mentioned. Gil also mentioned we have a role in on the transmission side a bit. The framework has been set by the governor in the bill that Alicia mentioned, the Accelerating Renewable Energy and Generation Community Benefits Act. I call it the Go Fast Act. And it sort of set up a whole set of new proceedings, or processes. But the thing, and it can get pretty arcane, but if you look at it, what it has done is it has figured out a way to actually pick projects with a greater sense of priority and urgency. And that's going on as we speak, again, with proposals to start flowing during the course of this year. It's picked a way to deal with the routes, the siting, the rights of way topic that you and Gil just got into. A lot of those are set up in this legislation. And finally, a transmission project needs economic viability. And again, we have a role in sort of in figuring out what is the best way to ensure that economic viability for a given project, whether it's a, sometimes it's an IPA project, sometimes it's what Gil called a FERC Order 1000 project, and sometimes it's a utility project. But we're in somewhat of a, apply judgment, be judicious, make things a cost-effective oversight role, still in the overall, within the overall mandate of going fast. So those are the main roles that we play. Clearly, Local Law 97 is a major impetus for all of this. We're excited for it. We know that it's already changed everything. It's changed the conversation. It's changed the discussions we're having with folks who now are, especially in the city, of course, who are now much more interested in their access to clean energy in all sorts of different ways. And I know you want me to talk about renewable energy, but I can't help myself. I also think that just as Local Law 97 has created powerful and compelling interest in renewable energy, it's very exciting to us that it's also created powerful and compelling interest in decarbonizing buildings, whether it's through energy efficiency, which we all agree is something of the first resource, or through the deployment of electrification and those kinds of solutions to get the buildings to where they need to be in a way that's a suitable match for what's going to be happening on the upstream, get new renewables built and get new renewables transmitted side. And obviously we're going to be fairly heavily involved in shaping the programs and the utility actions that can deliver on that decarbonization side as well.
Great, thank you. We have 5 minutes left, and I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about overcoming skepticism. 40% of carbon emissions in New York City come from burning oil or natural gas at the building. So when I talk to building owners about electrifying these systems, I'm often met with a very, very, very healthy dose of their skepticism that the grid will ever be green. And in fact, this skepticism is delaying the transition to electrification. So my question to each of you is, how do we demonstrate to everyone that a green grid in New York will be a reality? How can we give confidence that the actions that we're taking today are going to lead to a much lower carbon grid in the future? And so, John, maybe we left off with you. Maybe we'll start with you, get your thoughts on how we, demonstrate, that reality that the grid can be green.
Well, I think that there are people who have faith and believe in us, but those are not the skeptics that you're talking about. I think for the skeptics to convert, and more importantly, to start taking actions and making design and investment decisions as if this future was really truly coming, they need to see on the ground reality change. I believe that, and I believe that's imminent. I think we'll see the offshore wind projects that Alicia mentioned happening. We'll start to see some of these priority transmission projects happening. We're going to see the continued really impressive build out of renewables at the bulk level and distribution level across the state. So we will see projects actually happening. I believe, just to go off script for a second, that there's also the barrier to electrification is not just faith in the renewable energy upstream. There are other things that need to be taken on. And I'm a huge fan of Urban Green. I'm an alum of Urban Green, and I'm anticipating that at this conference we're going to have building decision makers and people who represent the workforce that's going to make this happen, and there's a design community, and there's a call to action for all of you as well here. Obviously, subject to being practical and doing things that make sense, but there's an opportunity for leadership here on the electrification front as well. Whatever role you're in, I do believe the grid will come. I'm certain of it, but we also need to have the building side of things be ready for it. I hope many of you listening to this panel will sign up for work on that front as well. Thanks, John.
Thank you, John. Gil, how about over to you? How do we overcome this skepticism?
I think you just need to look at, in the past, people were, skeptical that solar will never be economic, wind will never be economic, that storage is too expensive, and therefore, it's still far off. I'm not going to bet against the capacity of the U.S. and other countries around the world, and the energy of New York to really push the limits. As we have seen in those technologies, the cost curves and of those technologies came down a lot faster than all the skeptics thought they would go down. So I think technology innovation will be there because the commitment of jurisdictions like the state of New York is very clear. It's now codified in law, right? So this is not something that we want to do, we aspire to do. These are the goals that have been set in legislation. We have to do them. And because of that leadership that our governor has put forth, now we need to figure out, how do we get there? And I wouldn't bet against technology. I wouldn't bet against innovation. That we will have the tools, maybe not tomorrow, but along the way as we go through this journey of decarbonizing the grid and decarbonizing buildings.
Thanks, Gil. And maybe Alicia, final word to you. How do we overcome this skepticism?
Well, I think John and Gil are exactly right. So they didn't leave me as much new material to cover. It is absolutely true that renewables and other clean solutions have been beating expectations time and time again. The track record is extremely clear on that, and I think goes a long way to building confidence and the certainty, the big picture certainty of having requirements in law at the state level, at the city level, sends a strong investment signal that we're very serious about this. And I hope, I hope that's not doubted because, these are real requirements. They're binding. They're legally enforceable. So these transitions are going to happen, and we believe they will be not only possible but beneficial and cost effective. Again, as we've seen, the cost of renewables and other technologies falling. What we do need is to gain experience to make it tangible. And, John was speaking about that. And I think that's where, as a state agencies and partners, we really want to work with Urban Green and the participants, for this conference to start to get that real world experience. And I'll highlight, Governor Cuomo announced as part of his State of the State initiative back in January of this year, which of course feels like a very long time ago for many of us, given what New York City in particular has gone through since January, that NYSERDA would be sponsoring an Empire Buildings Retrofit Challenge. We haven't commenced that program yet, but programs like that and the other ones that we are already undertaking, things like our very successful real-time energy management program, which is being widely deployed in buildings in New York City and through channel partners with a lot of your members and building owners. We are starting to gain that hands-on experience, the operational experience within the buildings, the experience of putting forward development proposals for truly ambitious net zero projects. NYSERDA has been sponsoring a Buildings of Excellence competition, and we've seen very competitive and attractive proposals get awarded for net zero new construction in the multifamily space. Again, this is similar to what I was saying about offshore wind. This isn't 20 years from now. This is the work we're doing now. And yes, we do have a long way to go to hit these very ambitious targets, but we haven't wasted any time getting started. And if we are all working together, gaining that momentum and that hands-on experience, we will identify the solutions and innovations together that can come forward and can really fuel the progress we need to get where we're going.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our keynote panel for really setting the stage for the conference. Alicia, thank you so much. Gil, thank you. John Rhodes, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your support, all that you're doing to green the grid in New York, and thank you for setting the policy landscape for our conference today.